Welcome everyone at this late hour. Tonight we'll be talking about the goals and the challenges of the left in Europe and about international solidarity. I'm Luna Trochowska from the board of Młodymi Razem. I'm also the co-chairwoman of the International Relations Committee within Młodymi Razem, and I will be today's host. So I pass it to Valtteri.
Yeah, so my name is Valtteri Harakka. I'm the chairperson of the International Committee of the Left Youth of Finland, and I'm also on the International Committee of the Mother Party, which is called Left Alliance.
Okay, so our topics for tonight are LGBTQ rights, the climate change, workers' rights, socialism in the modern era, and international solidarity and the European Union. So starting off with the first question, Valtteri, would you like to talk about the LGBT rights in your country?
Yes, so to begin with, the main thing that has happened in the past few years with LGBTQ rights in Finland is that in the last government term, so last year, they passed a law which in Finland is called the trans law, but maybe in English a better title for it would be something like gender recognition law. And it came to force, I think, on the 1st of April this year. And this new law, whereas previously Finland was one of the only countries in Europe where you had to be chemically castrated to be recognized by the government for the government to recognize your gender identity. Now it's very much easier. It's only a matter of sending an official notice saying that you want to change your legal gender, and that's a big improvement for the trans people of Finland, but there are still big problems that remain with this law. One of those problems is that non-binary people are still not recognized, so you can only have your legal gender be either a man or a woman. There's no other options. And the second issue, or actually, let's go. I think there's three main issues. So the second one is that it only applies to people who are over 18. So underage trans people still are not getting the official recognition that they deserve and need. And the third main issue is that when it comes to, I think in English it's called gender affirming care. So that might be estrogen, or other treatments that you might need. There's not enough healthcare for trans people. So a lot of trans people end up having to go abroad, even to Poland or other countries like that, to get the care that they need. But if we're talking about other LGBT people other than trans people and non-binary people, then the situation is much better. Finland passed a gay marriage law some years back, so that's now a possibility. And gay rights are in general very good in Finland, and the society and culture is very open to gay people, but the problems that we now mostly have are with the recognition of trans and non-binary people.
So yeah, it's interesting to hear that some trans people go to even Poland for some procedures because we have a very limited variety of what the state can offer in terms of trans of transition. When we have a psychologist and an endocrinologist, and only estrogen is paid for by the state. For example, if a trans male would like to get testosterone, they need to get it on their own. So the situation is not really good. Most of the things that we do have are leftovers that the conservative parties didn't really pick up on. and like didn't notice them, so they didn't ban them yet. Like the ruling party is conservative, and none of the governments after the transformation have done really anything for LGBT rights. Like right now, the only party that is actually advocating for this is the Left Coalition, which is obviously Razem is obviously a part of that and is very noisy in that subject. So yeah, we have no gay marriage, for example. We have to sue our parents to even change our documents. So yeah, it's not great here either.
So the reason why people go to Poland and Estonia is another country people often go to is that there's only 2 clinics in Finland which deal with transgender issues, or I don't know what would be a more correct term, perhaps gender dysphoria issues. One is located in the city where I'm from, in Helsinki, and I think the other one is located in Tampere. But these 2 clinics are very understaffed or under-resourced. And also there's been some problems where the leaders of the clinics have been openly transphobic. People don't trust them very much. What works quite well with the clinics right now is hormonal treatment, so you can get estrogen or testosterone quite easily. But then if you need surgery, for instance, then the wait times can be very, very long. So people go to Poland, to Estonia, other countries, to private clinics where they
Okay,
pay.
to private clinics, that makes more sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so what would you think is the relation between capitalism and our struggle to win LGBTQ rights, and basically could rainbow capitalism lead us to queer liberation?
No, I don't think so. I think, in every European country, we've seen that corporations have become sort of ambassadors for pride. So at least in Helsinki, and I've been to a pride protest in England as well. You see all these big companies, your Burger Kings and McDonald's and Coca-Cola, all of them marching with rainbow flags. But as soon as, Pride Week or Pride Month is over, they forget about these issues. So I think for queer people, the main thing that affects them, or the main change, is done on the level of government. That means allowing gay marriages, allowing people access to trans care, and these sorts of things, and ending discrimination in the workplaces. But then another thing that needs to happen is a sort of societal change. The companies might play a small part in facilitating this societal change, but I don't think that's it. The input of the companies isn't enough for queer people to be liberated. You need the whole society, and especially the government, to be involved in this process.
Yeah, definitely. Like we can see that the companies only come in with pride flags and their profile pictures change only in countries that already had the work done in them. Like you won't see, I don't know, Shell change their profile picture in Saudi Arabia, but
Yeah, exactly.
you will in Britain, where the movement already won enough popular support to make it profitable for them to align themselves with that idea.
And I think that's an important point, that there's still, I can't remember the exact figure, but it's like over 50 countries in the world where being gay is still illegal. So I think, our governments really need to pressure those governments, like the government of Saudi Arabia, Iran, and these other countries, to change these policies as well. because I don't think queer liberation is something that happens, in our nation state as one. It's like a global process, similar to how socialism will be built. It's not something that we can do ourselves. It's something that we need solidarity for.
Yeah, we definitely cannot forget about the importance of LGBT rights in the entire world, not only in our country. And like, I guess the same goes for imperialism. Like, we cannot have a left movement that would support imperialism because when on the topics of LGBT rights, it just that the queer people suffer, especially when imperialism is conducted, and such actions hold back change in these countries, because if the material conditions are worsened by war, by shortages, by famine, then people cannot fight for their rights as much, and they are more concerned with food on their table than with the rights of other people. So that's also very important.
Another thing I'd like to bring up is I think that LGBTQ rights are, in the year 2023 more threatened than they have been in many years. In the US, we've seen growing hate against LGBTQ plus people. For example, the banning of drag shows, the banning of literature which features gay people, and these sorts of things are coming from the US to Europe, as well to Finland even, where we've seen in Helsinki a library was about to host a drag show, which was then, after some far-right people protested, the drag show was cancelled. And in one of the main newspapers in one of the supposedly most liberal countries in Europe, there was an editorial on the first pages where they said that drag should be banned because, think of the children, using these old American arguments. And I'm sure in Poland you've seen some of the same things, even though it's maybe not exactly comparable to the US and Finland.
I think when it comes to the US and how they influence the world with their ideas, in Poland, on that particular issue, we are just enough behind that we didn't feel the brunt of it, but it still impacts us greatly, especially as the younger generations consume more English media content, and they become more influenced by it. And for example, right now within the youth section of males, the Confederacy, which is like a far-right populist party that, or maybe more a coalition of three parties, which are either far-right nationalists, the others are libertarian, and the third ones are basically just conspiracy theorists. And that coalition has gained much support from the young male audience, and I think the cultural hegemony of similar ideas spread by the US have played, by the US far right, have played a much bigger role in that than before. Okay, so moving on to the next section, where we are going to talk about climate change and how it's interconnected with capitalism and what can we do about it. So let's start with the first question. What are the reasons for the climate crisis we are currently facing?
So I think that the reasons are very simple, and the reason is global capitalism. If you look at the charts which scientists have made, where you can see the global climate change, for example, the CO2 emissions before capitalism as an ideology formed in the 1700s, 1800s, the climate change was not an issue, and we were living on a sustainable planet even up to the 1960s or 70s, depending on where you live. But now we're talking about the situation where for the past 40 years we've overconsumed so much that we are destroying the planet, and the climate crisis cannot be solved within capitalism, because capitalism as an ideology is based on this overconsumption. All the growth that we've had in capitalist economies for the past 40 years has been at the cost of the planet. So all the benefits we've gotten in our lives, for example, technology, TVs, more food, more recreation, holidays abroad, that's all unsustainable when it comes to the climate. And now we're facing a situation where we essentially have to go back to the level of development that we had in the 1970s or 1960s or whenever, and having to consciously lower our living standards, which I don't think is possible within capitalism because of the individualistic philosophies which it promotes. This is a sort of societal change that we all need to adapt within our communities. I don't think the climate crisis is something that can be solved with, new technology, moving to Mars, as some capitalists would like us to do. I think the only solution for it really is the conscious lowering of our living standards, which can only be achieved under socialism or another sort of very large systemic change that's needed in our societies globally as well.
I think to the point that innovation cannot, this plain innovation cannot solve the climate crisis. I think it's important to see where these kinds of points are coming from, because before we had the billionaire-founded propaganda of the fossil fuel companies and others. Now I think more got involved, because it shows how capitalism basically destroys our planet, and it's a really big argument. So the narrative has shifted from before it was that climate change is not real, even though these companies knew that it was real back in the, I think it was 70s. I'm not sure, but it was that. Then it's real, but it's not human made, and we can't do much about it. And now it's just that we will solve it with this or that. We don't need to change the system. Everything is fine. We are going to innovate something that will basically solve our problems, because we did for all the past. And I think it's important to see that these kind of arguments are sponsored by basically foundations that are made by billionaires. What do you think that we can do about climate change? How do we fight it effectively?
So if we're talking about what policies we should take as socialists or as left-wing parties, then I think it's very important that when we solve or try to solve or start to solve climate change, that we make sure that these policies don't affect the working classes disproportionately. For instance, a lot of the working class still has to consume. For example, they have to drive cars, and it can be so that the working classes end up paying for climate change, which has ultimately been caused more by the billionaires and the millionaires in our countries rather than the average working person. And another point I'd like to bring up is that what's happening in terms of climate change right now is a sort of ecological imperialism, where we're turning our countries in the global north, which are comparatively rich. We're making them green, but then that's at the cost of the countries in the global south. So it's nice that we can have solar panels or electric cars here, but when the lithium and the solar panels are made, somewhere with very poor working conditions, that's not solving the issue. That's just moving the issue further to another country. As we've done with capitalism, you saw the exact same thing happening, in the 90s when our production started to be outsourced. So, for example, plastics or electronics that used to be in Europe have now moved to China, which is horrible for the climate. And these factories are polluting and destroying cities. But since it's somewhere else, not here, and we can't see the problem, then we think it's okay.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I think it shows how, like, even though we can regulate it here, and to various degree it can be effective or not, there will always be an incentive to do so, and sometimes we'll just move to the countries you mentioned, to the countries where it's not as visible to the first world worker, and they don't see it as an issue that much because, wow, they pollute, and then it even becomes another point that they try to blame it on them instead, like on the hypothetical countries that the jobs were outsourced to, instead of capital that outsourced these jobs and that profits from it.
Climate change and capitalism are similar in the way that neither one of them knows boundaries. It doesn't matter if a factory is in Poland or in Finland, we have the same climate. It doesn't matter if a capitalist is in Poland or in Finland, it's the same capitalistic system.
Okay, so moving on to the issue of workers' rights, how do you think we as the youth activists that are just entering the workforce or are not in the workforce yet, how can we work for the advancement of workers' rights?
So there's two kind of sides to this issue. If we're talking about workers' rights within capitalism or workers' rights more broadly. If we're talking about workers' rights more broadly, then, as socialists, we need to fight for a different economic system where the workers get their fair share of production and the money doesn't go to the owners of the factories or other capitalists. If we're talking about what we can do right now, other than, advocating for socialism, then I think that trade unions or labor unions are the most important institution that can help workers' rights. In Finland or in the Nordic countries, the reason why we've managed to build so-called welfare societies where people get relatively high wages, the only reason that we've managed to do that is because we have strong labor unions. In Poland as well, I think it would be interesting to hear your views on this, because I know that the labor unions in Poland have had a very important role in your history, but perhaps the workers' rights situation in Poland still isn't as good as it is in the Nordic countries or other countries. And I don't know, how do you see this situation?
Okay, so like within Poland, lately there were some advances. There were the solar strikes, which actually changed the conditions of people in Solaris. But other than that, the unions are still not really strong. We had, as you said, a big role played by trade unions in the past, as the Solidarity trade union was key in abolishing the Polish People's Republic, and it was a mass movement. There were millions of people in there, Now, Solidarity and some other unions are basically very complicit in capitalism and don't really fight for their workers as much as they could. But there is some rise in nuance, there is some rise in awareness, especially Razem are working on it. And I think that it is very important to advocate for class consciousness and for union membership, and especially union membership in those unions that actually want to fight for the workers. And you also had the Report Your Boss campaign, which worked with trade unions and was such an activity that I think was pointed at encouraging union membership. So would you like to talk more about that?
Yes, so we had a campaign that was called, the Left Youth of Finland had a campaign that was called Report Your Boss, and the idea was that young workers, people under the age of 30 who have had bad experiences at their workplaces can, with a low threshold report the kind of issues they faced, and that we would then try to help the workers with those situations, talking to the respective unions of those workplaces, and that was very successful. It got a lot of attention in the media, which started a discussion about the sort of abuse of young people in especially summer workplaces. And I think we received like 300 or 400 reports. Also, form of activism that we do with labor unions is that every January, to commemorate the sort of labor union victory, we meet with labor union activists, the left youth and the labor union activists meet at a hotel in the countryside or whatever, and we discuss labor policy. A lot of our members of the party and of the left youth also run in union elections, which helps the unions be more left-wing a lot, because as you said, in Poland they have a tendency to be more right-wing nowadays than they used to be. Of course, that's true in other countries as well, but if they have a body where people are elected, like a council of representatives or any of these institutions, then having left-wing and socialist voices in there helps, steer them in the right direction a lot, in my opinion.
Okay, so we talked about socialism and the need for structural change. How do you think in the modern era, in our times, what are the circumstances that we face? What are the obstacles that we need to overcome? And what comes with calling oneself a socialist?
I think that's a very, very difficult question, and I think we could spend, the whole day only talking about this one question. But I think the main challenge we face is that if you look at the countries where you've had successful socialist revolutions before, I'm talking about, the Soviet Union, Cuba, maybe China even. Not going into if you want to call these countries socialist or communist, just saying that they had successful revolutions. The material conditions in those countries were very poor when we had the revolutions there. And now in the northern, so-called Western countries, the material conditions for most people are very good. So of course people are less inclined to be socialist, even though they might have critiques of the capitalist system. In a lot of countries, they've done polls actually where it shows that the support among young people for systemic change, whether they want to call it socialism or anti-capitalism, is very, very strong. But the problem is that there is no political movement to gather all these anti-capitalist voices together to build something new. And then another issue, of course, becomes what do we want? What kind of society do we want to build? I think these are the main two challenges that come when you're not trying to build socialism. Then, of course, in Poland and Finland, I think we share the same experiences where socialism and especially communism have become sort of dirty words because of the Soviet Union and whatever the Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw
Yeah,
Pact,
definitely.
which is a very big challenge that we have to also face, especially as young people, because I think that we both agree, and probably all of the listeners or watchers agree, that what happened in the Soviet Union is not the kind of society that we want to build. We have to make a very clear distinction what our socialism means and what
Definitely.
their sort of society was.
Yeah, as a country of the former Eastern Bloc, we really have a problem where people are less inclined to try and learn about socialism because they say that what we had was socialism and that didn't work out, even though it obviously didn't meet all the criteria and was very, very flawed. And was brought upon by basically after the Soviet Union defeated the Nazis, and not really from a real Polish movement that was fighting for it. So because of that, we have a mentality that is very anti-socialistic, like especially as against the term. Because when you actually talk about the proposals that you are making, for example, you say that every person should have a job, or that there should be democracy in the workplace. The support is really high, but people don't associate it with any movement or with any political ideology. So we have a really difficult task to do. In Poland, we mostly fight for moving the so-called Overton window to the left, and the Razem party is nominally social democratic, and their program is mostly reformist. And that's largely due to the fact that we cannot talk about socialism because the term is so flawed in the public perception, and we need to kind of demystify it first.
In Finland, socialism is not the dirty word. Communism is more of a dirty word. So the youth party, we call ourselves, or we say that we're an ecological, feminist, internationalist, democratic socialist party. Whereas the adult party, I think in some documents they mentioned that they're a socialist party, but they don't really use it in their communications. And of course, their policy ends up being more reformist. But, this is, of course, an issue if you're a socialist party or a left-wing party in a capitalist society, then there is nothing else that you can be other than reformist or completely irrelevant.
Yeah, we lost sort of the idea that capitalism can even be overcome, that there can be an alternative, because when you talk with a capitalist or someone who believes in capitalism, even someone who has critiques of capitalism, you present them with your critiques of capitalism, with how we need structural change, then oftentimes you're met with, oh, but there can be, that's the best we got. There can be no real alternative because we already tried and we failed. So that's sort of mentality also influences politics a lot. But In the recent years, I think socialism in Poland is slowly becoming less of a dirty word, which I think also has something to do with, as we said before, the impact the US politics have, where the Bernie Sanders campaign, where he called himself a democratic socialist, even though his program wasn't really socialist. Same as, I guess, what the public perception of socialism is not really what they see as socialism is not socialism, but the impact the Bernie campaign had is definitely felt, where people are more inclined to call themselves socialists or democratic socialists, and I think it's moving in the right direction there.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and the Bernie Sanders campaign had a big effect around the world, especially in Europe and the US. And also, I think another factor, maybe you might disagree with this or you might agree, I don't know, is that it's now been so long that since the Soviet Union and the Eastern European Pact collapsed, that our generation, I assume that you're born after the Soviet Union collapsed, our generation really doesn't have the same sort of historic memory of what the Soviet Union was and what they call socialism. I think especially for young people it's very important to start building this new sort of revolutionary imagination, you might call it.
Definitely, that's a very good point. Okay, so moving on to international solidarity, international cooperation, that sort of thing we are doing right now. Yet I would like to ask you, like, what can we achieve by international cooperation? How can we do it? And what can be, basically, what can we achieve by it?
So the left wing of Finland, our party and the youth party, very strongly believe that international solidarity is needed in order to build whatever you want to call it, international revolution or an international socialist or social democratic alternative to what we have right now. The problem is that the institutions that we have for international cooperation, in my opinion, are not enough. Poland and Finland are, of course, members of the European Union. So we have some say in what happens in the European Union, but we don't really have enough of a voice there right now in order to change things. It's a very market liberal globalist project at the moment. It would take a very, our parties would need a lot of support in order to change what that looks like currently. In addition, we of course have the UN, but we've seen that the UN isn't really powerful enough to solve even international conflicts. Not even talking about trying to establish international socialism. And then we have some of these sort of international socialist groups, whatever, the European Left, the Fourth International, some of these organizations. But I don't think that the level of cooperation that we have currently is enough, and I think that we should try to form some sort of new organization. I don't know what that would look like. I don't have answers. I come to you only with the problems. But I think there is definitely a space and a need for a new European or international sort of socialist space, because I think of course you can't build socialism in one country, as we saw in the Soviet Union and Cuba and other countries. But also it's very good to share what experiences we have, what sort of campaigns we do in elections, in order to gain support in our respective countries, because we have a lot to learn from each other.
Yeah, definitely we do, and we can also talk about our problems, our current conditions, and sometimes we can even do solidarity strike, for example, solidarity protests. An exchange of experiences is very important. And when it comes to the form of it, we are a part of the European Left Youth Network, for example, but a sort of wider, more powerful, maybe, if you would like to call it, an organization that would be a place for all these socialists to interact and to organize together would definitely come in handy. But like we as Razem are currently trying to build regional connections with other parties, for example, like Podemos or Your Mother Party, and I think it can really alter the way that that international politics are conducted, for example.
Yes, definitely. I agree with you on those points. Maybe also we'd like to talk about the war in Ukraine. I think that it has shown why international cooperation is so important. The European Union countries and the US have given record amounts of aid and military aid even to Ukraine, which has helped them defend against the Russian invasion. But there, in the same instance, we've also seen the problems with left-wing international cooperation. Our parties share, or have very different views on the war in Ukraine and very different analysis on the causes and what should be done. I think that, the Polish and the Finnish vision or the Nordic countries' vision is very similar, but then, when you go to Southern Europe, it becomes completely different, or to Eastern, to, the Balkans or places like that.
Or the US, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad we can agree on that. Yeah, there is much to be done. Obviously, the aid is to be sent, and we can also advocate for things such as foreign debt relief or forgiveness. We also have to look at the trade unions that are fighting for workers' rights in Ukraine, because while we need to support the Ukrainians fighting, and the international aid really comes in handy with that, it also comes with strings attached that basically influence the government to pass anti-worker legislation. So we need to see that, and we need to speak up about it, so that we can pressure governments to basically change the way in which international aid is sent.
And also we need to keep in mind that even though supporting Ukraine is very important, there is a sort of Eurocentrism or even racism involved in this. We're supporting Ukraine because it's a European country, whereas we're not supporting many other countries in the world. For example, I don't know, Sudan, who's now having a seeming civil war, or we didn't supply the same amount of aid to Georgia when Georgia was invaded by Russia because, it's further away. We don't really care about it. And I think especially in far-right rhetoric, you've seen in the Nordic countries that they've become much more pro-immigration all of the sudden, that we've seen these Ukrainians in need come to our countries.
Yeah, we have it really visible on our borders, how there's double standards for who we support and who we do not support, who we let in, because when we gladly took in all the immigrants from Ukraine, there is also an ongoing crisis on the border with Belarus, where Lukashenko promised many, for example, Kurds and people from the Middle East and poorer countries to that they can come to Europe and that they can do so for Poland, and they were basically sent there, and now there is a humanitarian crisis because all these people are on the border. The Belarusians don't want them to go back to their country, and the Polish state does not let them in, while we let other immigrants in, even though they're in as dire situations are as Ukrainians. And we are also advocating on that to change it to let all people in. And yeah, it's basically very important to not forget about well, people who are not maybe okay, sorry. Yeah, I think it's more important to not forget that we need to stay in solidarity with all the people of the world, and especially those that we can materially support. So I guess a question that needs to be asked apart from that is, how can we as workers in the so-called first world, in the West, in the European Union, how can we be in solidarity with workers from other regions of the world, and especially those more impacted by imperialism? What would you say?
I'll give you 2 points. One is that we have to establish better relationships with people outside of Europe. Right now, European politics is very Eurocentric. We have the European Union, and then we have the European countries, and the US maybe, but then the rest of the world seemingly doesn't exist. One or is our enemies, quote unquote enemies like Russia or China. So especially, you know, with African, Asian, and South American countries, we hardly hear anything about them and their left-wing liberation struggles or whatever. And I think it would be very important to you know, learn from them and to maybe help them if they need help. But of course, it's not our position to say who needs our help and who doesn't. And the second point I'd like to make is that we need to destroy the systems of global capitalism, which force these nations, which have formerly been colonies, which have then become, you know, imperialist under imperialist rule, the so-called third world or the global south, which is now very much reliant on debt to finance their projects, and this debt is then has much higher interest rates than the debt of European or Western countries. So we need to destroy the system of global finances, especially the International Monetary Fund, in my opinion, completely. This is not something that we can have and have these countries be at the same level or in the, you know, same on eat from the same table in the same round table, however you would say it in English.
I think it's especially important to, as you said, our politics are very Eurocentric in Europe. I think it's especially important to combat this kind of notion, and especially the, as you called it, the view that there are European countries, there are democracies, and the rest of the world is basically either non-existent or our enemies, proclaimed by our states. I think it's important to realize that their conditions are worse, or they might have less freedom of speech because of the governments that are actually supported by the Western powers to their benefit. And when actual movements for liberation and for change in these countries occur, then the imperialist powers calm down with either direct military aid or money for reactionary groups. And especially when it comes to war, we need to protest against imperialist wars that are conducted. For example, the war in Iraq, where Poland even fought and occupied a portion of Iraq, which is even more relevant to the question of the Kurdish migrants on the border, because that region was heavily affected by war, and because of that, these people were in that condition that led them to get basically abducted by the Lukashenko regime and then put on the border, and we need to stop it from happening. We need to protest it, and we need to have an alternative vision of how international politics should be conducted.
Yeah, touching up on what you said, of course, Poland played a role in the Iraq war, Finland played a role, but it's also important to recognize that, there's only one country which is, the biggest imperial power nowadays, which is the US, and of course now Russia fighting the war in Ukraine and previously in Georgia, but the US has for the past, 50 years plus had regime change operations, especially against left-wing governments in South America and Latin America. And we can't recognize one enemy or one imperialist power of Russia without recognizing that there's also, other imperialist powers like the US, which we need to combat, especially on the level of government diplomacy. We need to say that, we don't want to support a country that, makes foreign wars around the world.
Okay, so our last and final topic for today is the question of the European Union, how we as leftists should approach it, and what are its flaws, what are the benefits of the European Union. Share with us your perspective.
I think this is another one of those very difficult questions that we could spend many, many hours talking about, but this is also a kind of a controversial issue, I think, in the European left, where we at the same time recognize that what the European Union is right now is not what we would want it to be, but then the question becomes, how do you reform it, or how do you abolish it, and what comes after it? The European Union is founded on principles of liberal free markets and uniform standards, which are not compatible with building a left-wing society, at least in my opinion. But also, as we saw what happened with the UK with Brexit when they left the European Union, the alternative might be even worse than what we have right now within the European Union. I think right now the only thing that we can focus on is trying to build like a unified left-wing vision of Europe in the European Parliament, and trying to gain support from our voters, and telling them these issues that the way we see them, that this isn't a perfect institution, but there is some things about it that could be salvaged, and within that left-wing European Union, or in the left-wing European Union group, trying to work towards lessering these free market legislations and building new legislations, for example, about minimum wage or workers' rights, and solving the issues that we face in the European Union politics right now.
Yeah, I agree with you that it's not really possible or maybe it's possible, but it can lead to even worse conditions. To withdraw from the European Union, to say that because it is neoliberal and because it's founded on such principles, we should work towards leaving it and abolishing it. I think at this point, due to how integrated the economy is, due to the work that has been done, we really can't retreat to national borders, and it's way more productive to try and build, as you said, left-wing alternative for what for how the European Union looks like right now, and try to advocate for it, try to change it, and there are issues like we have these elections 5 years to every 5 years to the European Parliament, but it's largely influenced by lobbyists, and there is more power within the bureaucracy of the European Union, and that's something that only we as the left can address, because there's little talk of such subjects in other political movements.
Yeah, looking at the institutions of the European Union, you have the European Parliament, the Council, and then what's the third one called in English? Anyway, but my point is that the Parliament doesn't have legislative power even at the moment. That's maybe something that we as the left should be talking more about, that we have this institution which is not a fully democratic institution, because only the Commission can introduce laws for the Parliament to be voted on. And another thing I'd like to talk about is how this issue, I think, is very interesting, because in different countries we have very different views on it. So Poland and Finland share similar views, where we see that the European Union is not good, but the alternative would be worse. But then when you go to Norway, which isn't a part of the European Union, the left-wing parties in Poland are very much against joining the European Union. And then if you go to Denmark, at least one of the youth socialist parties is very much against the European Union. So this is a very complicated issue, and I don't think it's something that we can even come to a consensus about when we're talking about, what kind of Europe should we build in the European Parliament in the future. And I think a lot more work needs to be done on that front, and it remains to be seen even how well the left-wing parties will do at the next European elections. Is it next May, I think, or next June, whenever it is. I think in many countries that have been very important for the left-wing in Europe, for example, in Germany, I think we'll see a lot less German Die Linke MEPs being elected. We might see some more from Spain or Portugal, but it remains to be seen what the future of the left in Europe is, because the European Greens and the European Social Democrats, I think, have very different views. I think that they see the work that the European Union is currently doing as enough, or they're more reformist about it than we are, whereas we think that the whole system needs to be reformed from inside out. So it's a very, very challenging issue, and I think this is something that we'll be talking a lot more about next year and in the years to come, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens.
All right, so I think it was a very interesting and productive discussion. Thank you very much for coming here today.
Thank you for having me.
I hope we can do more of that, such things in the future, maybe with comrades from other organizations as well, from other countries. Today we were planning to have YDSA on, but unfortunately they couldn't come. I hope in the future we can have a wider perspective, but this one was I think, wide enough. And yeah, I'm looking forward to more cooperation with you.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. And I'd also like to wish a very happy May Day to everyone who's been watching. And thank you from my part as well for watching. If you want to follow our organization on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, the account is Vasemmistonuoret, which is a very difficult name to pronounce. Maybe for the Polish people, I don't know if Luna will maybe put a link somewhere, but it's spelled
Definitely.
Vasemmistonuoret.